So good morning and good evening, everyone, and welcome in ApexR. My name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm the founder of the ApexR, and today we are going to talk about the Lightning Web Component best practices. And we have a great star on the Lightning Web Component train with us. So let me hand over to him.
Hello, everybody. My name is René Winkelmeyer. I wouldn't call myself a star. I'm a developer evangelist with Salesforce, and I'm really excited to show you a few things around Lightning Web Components, which is our new programming model that we introduced quite recently with the Spring 19 release. And in this webinar, we're going to focus on a few things, right? Public properties, private properties, and how you can use them for building, for really composing your components effectively. We will talk about event communication with child to parent, as well as for sibling components, which is what we call pubsub. There are a few things that changed compared to the oral programming model that you should be aware of. And we'll talk also like when and when not to use Apex with your Lightning Web components. Last but not least, we will also cover Aura interoperability. And if we find some more time at the end, I'm also happy to show you some stuff around how to debug your Lightning Web components, and maybe also some testing. So let's start first with the really simple part, using public and private properties for effective component composition. I have here our LWC recipe applications, which you can get free on GitHub. If you haven't seen that before, that's a super neat application that we built. It's free, it's open source. You can do all those things in here, so that download that, clone the repo, deploy to a scratch org, experience how the recipes that you will see in this webinar actually also work in your scratch org or in your developer edition org, and then dig into the code how that works. Now, talk about parent to child communication, and I have this org currently in debug mode enabled, so let's wait a bit. We have this tab over here, parent to child, to show you a few things how to communicate from a parent component to a child component. As you know from the Aura programming model, we have this component-based approach, which really allows you to build standalone components that can then be reused across multiple parts of your org. Now, looking at the very first example, API property, it's really simple. I have a simple Lightning input field. I'm changing a value, and I have my chart bar Lightning Web component at the bottom that automatically updates this nice CSS-based chart just based on the value that I have in my parent component. And there's no real, not many things involved in here. So let's look at the code for this API property component, and for the chart bar component, how we actually use public properties that are exposed in the chart bar component. So I'm going to VS Code for this. Let's open my API property component. There are two things. First of all, I have here within VS Code my chart bar component, right? C-chart/bar, and every public property that I have exposed in this component is just an HTML attribute, right? And you know this likely from our components before. So I have my percentage in here, and as a parameter, I am passing the percentage value, which is just a JavaScript property in the JavaScript file of my API property component. So it's pretty simple. You see this Lightning input field is changing the percentage value, and we're then reusing this in the chart bar component. Now, let me drill down into the chart bar. This is also in VS Code really handy, because I just can do a command click in here, and it will automatically lead me to the JavaScript file of the Lightning Web component that I just selected in the other markup. Now, as mentioned before, Add API, this is the decorator that we use in Lightning Web Components to define public properties. And this is also the name of the public property that you have in here. Based on the value that gets passed down from the parent component, the value of percentage gets set here. It is really important to understand that every property that is decorated with add API is a read-only value. Compared to any things that you remember from Aura, where you had two-way data binding, right? So you can mutate the percentage value in the child component, and it would automatically update in the parent component. This won't happen here, right? With Lightning Web Components, we introduce one-way data binding from parent to child. Now, in this chart, for example, when I'm going to open the HTML file for that, you see that we use the style property, or the style getter from the JavaScript file. So let me actually put that side by side. That's a bit more obvious, right? So we have a getter here, we call it style, and we reuse that in the style property for this div. And this is the reason why when the parent component updates the value and passes the percentage number down to the child component, that this gets automatically re-rendered. I want to also, this is one other important part when you look into composing your Lightning Web Components, right? Whenever percentage changes, we check, is any property like percentage or style used in your HTML template, like percentage or style here, and only if that is the case, we are going to force a re-render in the HTML template, right? So if you wouldn't use percentage, like here, if I would remove this, we actually wouldn't re-render that part to make, to give you a real snappy experience for rendering the HTML, right? And we do that automatically, but it's really important to understand if you have an add API decorated property, or also decorated with add track, and you're not using that within your HTML template, you won't see a re-render. Now, this is a real simple usage of public property. Now let's look at a more distinct use case where we don't expose a property, but a function. As you see here, we have again an API function, a parent component, and we have a clock child component. When I'm going to hit the refresh button, the time in the clock component updates. Now, you may say, oh, it's like an API property, right? You just changing the time value in API function, and you're passing down the value via a public property to the clock Lightning Web component. Now, we decided to do that differently. So let's take a look at API function and at the clock component. Again, opening that over here. And what you will see is, when we also look at the HTML template for that, it's a bit different, right? Put it side by side. We have this lightning button over here, which on click calls the handle refresh function in my JavaScript file. So let's take a look at that. And oh, this one is actually not changing a property, and it's not creating a value. What it's doing, it is running a query selector on clock, which is, as you see, the tag name of our custom Lightning Web component. And we are calling a function on that child component, right? So you see, we don't pass anything down, but we're calling a function on the child component. Now, let's look how this function is actually defined. And it is like a public exposed property, right? You can also expose functions with @API to allow a parent component to run this function. And I think this is pretty powerful. You may not have the functionality or properties that you define in your parent component, but you have an encapsulated function or mechanism within your own component that you don't want to expose to a parent component, but where a parent component should be able to execute that, right? And in this case, it is just an exposed function. This is pretty decent. One example that I envisioned or that I worked with some time ago was kind of a standalone mini video player, right? And this video player component just exposed like start, stop, play, pause as public functions, right? And any parent component could just run that function without knowing anything of the implementation details of my own small video player component. Now, this is function it can never be written, so we don't have to talk about read write, but there are other cases where you may want to have this capability. So let's take a look at the API getter and setter. In this case, I've a small description, whatever, small to-do app. We all know this, the sentence use cases. I'm going to add a few more of them. What's basically happening here is I'm passing down a set of data down to a child component, but this child component may have to do something with the data that I'm passing down. And as you remember from the API property example over here, when you decorate a public property with an API so that it's publicly exposed, it is also only read-only for you. Now, how you actually can modify that? So let's go to the API getter setter example. API getter setter. There we go. Again, I have here my to-do list custom component, and it's filled, the public property to-dos is filled with the value of my own local to-dos properties. So let's look over here. And what we're doing here is that the parent component, in this case, has a predefined list of to-dos. And on this save, so basically my button click, we are adding to the existing array, and the three-dot notification, this three-dot notation is part of the new JavaScript syntax, just a new object for these to-dos, right? So we are passing down an ID, we're passing down a description, and we are passing down a priority. So, no big magic. The question is, how does it actually look like now in the to-do list? And the to-do list has now another option, which is @API. And compared to just exposing the setter, we have a predefined set of getter and setter. So the question is, why is this really, why do you want this? Why does it make sense to use this? And there may be use cases when your child component or your component, once it's going to receive data from a parent component, that you want to run action. Like, in our case, running the filter to do's function, right? This can be a real world use case. Your parent component is sending something and you're receiving that data, and now you want to do something with the data. You want to filter it, you want to mutate it. There are several different things. And in our case, once the public property is set, we are storing it into a private variable. This is only visible to our own component. And then we are running the filter to do's method, right? So we're doing some stuff, we're filtering the to do's, whatever your magic your functionality, your business purpose may be in your own functions. But it's important that we run this whenever the parent component changes the value of my child component. It's important to know that you also, when you create this custom setter, you also have to create a custom getter, right? So you can't have an API only with the setter. If you do so, you have to apply the setter and getter, which is fine for us because we just need the to-do's value, and we're storing that in our private variable. And once we want to reuse the to-do's property in our local HTML template, we are running this getter to-do's, which in fact returns only the value of our private variable to-do's. Okay, so far we have those, the three examples: API property. Simplest example possible, where you only have a public property exposed with API, and I really have to reiterate over that. Those properties are read-only. You can't mutate them. That will throw an error at runtime in your browser. If you want to expose specific functionality to parent components without providing more implementation details to your parent component, or you don't even rely on information that it's coming from your parent component, there's the API function option that you can use. And whenever you have to run specific functions when your parent component changes data, when it's passing down for you and you want to filter some stuff or mutate data, whatever you want to do with that, then having a custom getter and setter on your API decorated property is the way to go. Now, this is all parent to child communication. And looking back in the past, in our world, there was always, people used a lot for events, for going back and forth between parent to child, but also with child to parent. Now, when you communicate from a parent to child, you always use @API. If you want to communicate from a child component to parent components or to your parent component, then you have to apply what we provide here in the child to parent recipes, and this is using events, right? So I talked to a few people and they mentioned, oh, we can also do use events for sending information or data from our parent components to our child components. And I just want to say no, because that's a bad practice, right? Please use events only when you want to communicate from a child component to a parent component. Now, there are a few different options that you have to obey, where you have to look at. So the simplest option is, as you can see in this event simple example, you have your parent component, and something changes. In our case, it's only this page number value over here. Now, when we look at the actual implementation, event simple, and our paginator, what you see here is actually what is happening, right? So I'm going to actually open this HTML file. In our parent component, we have the paginator. And in this paginator, we have two event listeners, on previous and on next. What you have to understand is that this is a real standard pattern that applies to standard web development. You likely know on click, on mouse hover, and all the different events that exist in general. So we created our own event handlers, which have in common the prefix on. This is just something that you have to add before such an event handler, and then the name of the event. Because when you see here on my right screen what the paginator is actually doing, it is dispatching event of type a new custom event, and it's giving it the name previous. I wanted to change that, I would say my previous event would be something like whatever, Renee. Then I could just change this handler to on Renee. And whenever the child component, the paginator, would dispatch an event with the name Renee, this event handler would actually fire and would call my handle previous event. It is really important to know that those events don't bubble up the DOM tree, right? So if your application would rely on that, the Renee event would leave the scope of event simple and would even go to a higher parent component, that would not work. We will come to that example in a bit. But really, it's like from your child to a parent. This is the simplest way how you can expose an event. And what's noteworthy is that handle previous, this function is actually part of the event simple JavaScript, right? So and that's really nice because your parent component says, okay, if the child sends an event with that name, I can have in my parent component the actual functionality to listen and to execute on that. Okay, so this is really basic, simple example where the event does not leave the scope of the current component. Now, as it's often the case, you may have events with data, right? So like in this case, we have a parent component event with data, and we have a child component that has a list of contact list items. So I'm going to click here, and what's happening that my parent component is now displaying detail information, which is based on data from one of my child components. Now I'm actually passing data up the way. So let's take a look how we do this. Event with data. And I'm going to open also the HTML file for that. There we go. Now, what's happening here is that within our template for each, right, we have the child component, contact list item. And contact list item has a few properties, right? It has a contact ID, it has a contact, so just one of the iterables from our for each, and on the select event, we are running the handle select function in the event with data Lightning Web component. Now, contact data, this is just data that we provide, so the whole list of contacts that we are using in the iterable is provided by the event with data Lightning Web components. So let's take a look at the contact list item, how we're actually sending data up from a child to a parent. This contact list item has a single hand click function. So you remember from the demo, when I clicked on the image, it automatically updated in the parent component the detailed data. As we have the whole contact over here, we are doing a few things. First of all, it's a click event, right? An on-click event. And we are using for that also an anchor tag, as you can see here, an ahref, right? And this usually would run its own event. The standard, standard DOM event, it's standard application behavior, as you would have that from any other type of web development. So the first thing that we have to do is we're preventing the default behavior so that we don't get a new browser tab. And then we want to send data up to the parent component from the child. And this is a two-step process. You can put that likely into one line of code, but we have a clean example over here. So first of all, we're defining the event as a const. We're creating a new custom event, and custom event has the capability to have actually a JSON body with the detail property. So this is also really standard. We can likely Google that up and find documentation on the Mozilla Developer Network about that, where you can have this detailed property and pass in any kind of data. Now, when I say any kind of data, don't do any kind of data, right? So in this case, one could say, hey, we have this contact already here, and we could pass down now the whole contact, right? We could just pass up again this whole object. But this would be, it's just not the best practice. And because of two things. First of all, as you remember from the public properties, anything that you decorate with @API is also read-only. So what you would do actually is you would pass up to your parent component a value that is read-only. So it may want to mutate the data or do something else with that, and it can't because you're passing up a whole read-only value, right? It is more a best practice to actually only add some kind of primitives to your detail body. Like when I move the bag, I'm just setting up the ID that was selected. And I can do that because my parent component has already the list of all the contacts. So based on the idea, I can then select the one. Using the detail attribute is also not limited to one value, right? So you can easily go further and just changing that a bit here and say, I have my property here and my prop B with something else. So this whole detail bag is just not limited to provide only one value, but also multiple values, which is it's a really nice example of how you can send data around. Now, again, event with data, I had this on select, handle select. So I have this function attached to the child component. And this is, and we actually do this because we are using a so-called non-bubbling event. So every element must have a listener. You can imagine now, if you have a list out of 500 list items, we will have 500 event listeners just here in your component. And that may be not as effective as you want to. For actually getting that, let's close all the things here. You can use event bubbling. It looks, similar, right? I have the same list, I get the same functionality, but the underlying stack, how when the event is listened to, that actually happens on a higher level. So let's take a look at the event bubbling for that. So event bubbling, there we go. And while we use the same contact list item, you will notice that there is no onSelect listener here, right? Compared to that, I have on the outer Lightning layout item only one event listener attached, which is called now onContactSelect, right? So this is different to the two other examples that you saw before. You see here now that the event is not attached to the child component. The parent component totally controls that. So let's see what the real difference is, right? Because it should be somehow the same. So let me go to contact list item bubbling. And what happens here is that we have bubbles equals true, right? Bubbles equals true is a property that you would set on a custom event when it should leave, when it should bubble up the DOM further than you want, right? So it's like, it's not only attached to here, it also goes over to our Lightning layout item. Now, when I look at the JavaScript file for that, it just handles select, it gets event target contact. So it's also different from the previous example. We take the whole contact property on the child component for that. We often got the question, how can I have events that bubble up all the tree, that go all the way up from my current component to another parent component to a grandfather component. And we really encourage you to not build this kind of paradigm, right? So if, for this example, event bubbling, this component would have another parent component. Let's call it my master component. And this my master component would also do something based on the contact select event, like here, right? We really encourage that you don't use bubbling up events, but that in this case, you would catch it and you would issue a new event which goes to your my master web component. And the reason for that is pretty simple. You want to test things, right? And if currently you would rely in this scenario where you have an outer my master component and then event bubbling component and then your contactless item bubbling component, you don't want to rely that the grandchild component contactless item bubbling sends the event. Because if this implementation detail changes at some point in the future, your outer component would rely something that it does not control. And also, it's not really unit testable. That's why we also discourage that. Now, all the examples that I show now is for event communication for child to parents. But looking at what you usually do in Salesforce.org is you have components that live side by side, right? Standard at builder scenario, you have a component, you have a record detail page, you drag a component, your bottom left, another top right, but they also should be able to communicate with each other, right? And that was pretty easy in the other programming world. It's similar easy in the Lightning Web Component world. But also there are a few things. First of all, what you currently should know is that there is no out-of-the-box mechanism that empowers you for a sibling communication with events, right? This will come later at a later point on the platform. But to fill this gap, we provided you within the LWC recipe sample application with a small pubsub helper library that actually allows you to have the sibling communication. Now, let's do a simple example. Let me find Amy on my search bar. It's sending this value over to this totally unrelated sibling component. I'm clicking my name here, and I'm getting the contact details on the right. Now, this pubsub component is a small web component without an HTML file. I'm just opening this really quickly. You don't have to dig into all those details, but the noteworthy part is you find it within the pubsub folder, within the LWC folder of the LWC recipes application. As you see here, it is only a metadata file and a JavaScript file, so that's why we can provide this utility function this way. And let's actually look what it includes to reuse this pubsub library. First of all, it has a few different ES6 modules that you can import. It has the fire event. You would use this when you want to send data where another component is listening on. And for using this, you need a few things to embed within your Lightning Web component. The first thing is you have your current page reference and you have to import that from Lightning Navigation. Adding to that, you have to also use the AddWire decorator for current page reference. And the reason behind this is when you fire an event and you have multiple pages open, multiple tabs open, and a few of them are cached, you want to make sure that only the components that live on the actual page are also reacting on any event that you may fire using the pubsub mechanism, right? And that's why we're using the current page reference in combination with the fire event function, so that every event that gets fired is only really associated to the actual page. And fire event has 3 parameters. First of all, the page reference. That's great. You give it a name, so whatever your event as name should have, and then you would pass the value. And in our case, this is just a simple string value, but it can also be more complex JSON object if you want to, right? So this is actually how you would fire an event, and other components that listen on events would then be able to consume that. Now let's take a look at how that looks like when you set up one of those components. I'm going to the contact list for that. Again, you will need a few things. First of all, again, the current page reference. Then you have the register listener and unregister all listeners modules that you have to import from the pubsub web component. Why is this important? When a page gets initially rendered and attached to the DOM tree, we have the execution of the connected callback lifecycle method over here. And this is the point when this web component registers the listener for pubsub for the search key event, right? So, it listens then permanently for any event that gets fired by pubsub where this name is actually part of the naming convention. And once it registers that such an event got fired, it will call the local handle search key change method over here, which we see just here, right? So you can add multiple of them. You can attach them directly to any function local to your Lightning Web component. What is important is, with everything, when you set up things, you also should clean them up, right? And you shouldn't forget that, because otherwise you would have multiple unneeded listeners registered to your application. So if you're going to use this model, and every web component that is going to register listeners has also to call the unregister all listeners function here within the disconnected callback lifecycle method. And the disconnected callback lifecycle method gets called when your Lightning Web component gets unattached from the DOM. And with this, you really ensure that just everything stays really clean. Some people say you don't have to do that. We highly recommend that, so that nothing gets confused, because once you're going to render the same web component, you would have multiple listeners attached, right? And you just want to avoid that. And this is why we highly recommend to do it this way. Okay, so far with events, and now let's talk about something that I find is really exciting, to talk about when to use Apex and when not to use Apex. I think in the previous webinar, you saw the different options, how you can use Apex in your Lightning Web components, and there are a few different things. You can use them with EdgeWire, the decorator that it can then be used to run any read Apex operations, right? No create, update, delete, but for read operations, but also where you can use imperative Apex so that you can execute Apex, for example, on a button click. Now, there's one really, in my opinion, really awesome addition that we added with Lightning Web Components to the Lightning Component Framework in general, and that is the use of the UI API. For those of you who are not familiar with that, we added, I think it's around 16 months ago, the new UI API, or User Interface API. And the User Interface API has the capability you have a standard REST endpoint, you provide, for example, an account ID or 1-2 parameters, and the API gives you full access to, in the context of the current user, to all metadata and data for that record. There can be an account like translated labels and fields, field names and validations and values and page layout, all those things, no matter what you're asking for based on the REST endpoint that you're hitting. Now with Lightning Web Components, we exposed the UI API also as JavaScript for you. And that just means for any single record transaction, and it's the emphasis is on single record, you don't have to write a single line of Apex. And I'm going here through 2 examples, right? I have my whatever example. I'm going to create an account, and now I have my successful account creation. I'm getting back an idea, and this all happened without writing Apex. And the other option is, really simply, I'm going to delete records, and I also can delete records without writing Apex, which I think is pretty cool, because if you don't have to write Apex, you don't have to write Apex tests. This is another thing that we shouldn't forget about that. So let's take a look at how LDS create record works to make that happen, and LDS delete record, that you can do single record transaction without writing Apex. I'm going to LDS create record. So what you will see, and I'm just going to hold against that quickly, a simple Apex method. Let's take this one to property. So you can remember from the previous webinar, when you use Apex methods, you import them as a default, get contact list in this case, and you import that from @salesforce/Apex, and then the name of your controller and the name of the Apex method. For the UI API, we have a kind of similar approach, right? You import the function that you want to have, in our case, create record. And as you can see, it creates a new record using the properties and record input, which is a special kind of input. I will talk about that in a bit. And you import that from the UI record API. And you can also, we can also add things in here just for the showcase. You can update record, right? Or can delete record. And there are a few things that UI record API offers. Like when I do a command click, I can directly see, what is exposed, what are the things that I can do with that. Also really powerful implementation within Visual Studio Code. Now let's go back. I have my create record over here. I just imported that. And my create account functionality is doing a few things. First of all, I'm creating a standard JSON body, and then I am creating my record input. So what you should know is, because this is using the UI API, the user interface API, everything that you see, like the shape of this record input, is defined by the user interface API. So when you go on the web, open your browser, and you search for UI API Salesforce, you will see all the documentation that relate to the user interface API. You will also find them in addition on the Lightning Web Components documentation for sure. But based on that, you will see the shape of the data that you have to provide. So in this case, I'm defining the API name, and I'm giving just an array of fields with their values, and that's it. And create record is actually just a promise, right? So it's a standard promise. I'm passing this record input JSON body as a parameter, and then based on the return data, in this case, for example, the account ID, and please respect it's a lowercase I for the ID, it's just what it is. Just don't get irritated, just a lowercase I. Then you can proceed to consume the data after the record got created. or in the case of an error and just, I said, just a promise, doesn't work, okay, it's just catching the error. Now, create record, you saw that also in the demonstration has this delete record option. Now let's go for LD delete. Again, you just import the delete record over here, and it's as simple as passing down the record ID as a parameter, right? That is like really simple, but with those few lines of code, I can create any kind of record. I can delete any kind of record, and I can also update any kind of record. There are a few more APIs available that you can use, for example, for list views. Let me quickly see if I have that handy over here. No, I think that was in the Apex one. Oh, sorry, this one. Take me there. Okay, so one thing to add is when to use Apex or not. What's always overlooked is that we introduced also with Aura components some time ago, Lightning Data Service, and namely with that things like record edit form, RecordView Form that actually provide you with capabilities to build forms, also for user input, like new forms, just with markup. So without any usage of JavaScript. So let me quickly change the full name over here. I'm going from Amy to do it Renee. I'm going to save that. Right, and you see that it automatically updated in a totally unrelated area of my web component automatically. Right, this is just one of the things where it's really neat to use just a markup-based approach if you have standard forms to display. Like when I look here at dynamic schema, for example, dynamic schema, let me take this one. It just consists out of a Lightning record form, which has actually only 3 parameters, right? The object API name where it's associated with, the record ID, if applicable, right? And the list of fields that should be displayed and automatically generated, right? So when I'm going to look at the JavaScript for this, a bit fast. There we go. The JavaScript is actually really short, right? It has the record ID, which I'm getting with my add API decorated property. It's a standard property. It gets exposed based on the current Flexi page. The same applies for object API name, but you can also compute that with a private property if you want to. And in our case, or in this case, I'm just having a standard JavaScript array with the field names that should be displayed in my Lightning record form. So in the past, we saw it often like, you have to rebuild all your forms and you have to fetch the data with Apex. It gets displayed. Once the user changes that and mutates the data, you want to save that. And the saved data then goes back into an upsert or an update or Circle query. And with using just the standard markup, like Lightning record form, you also would avoid any of the round trips doing this. Now, having said that, Apex won't go away, right? I mean, there are many use cases where you should need that mass transactions, getting specific data, list data based on circle queries and so forth. But for single record transactions, it's highly encouraged to investigate the capabilities of the UI API. They're all well documented in the LWC documentation, so that you then can get a grasp on actually, like we did when we rewrote all our sample apps to Lightning Web Components, we deleted a lot of Apex because we just don't need it any longer. Okay, so far about this, when not to use Apex with Lightning Web Components. One thing that is really important to us is that because we introduced this new programming model, which is called Lightning Web Components, it also means you still have your Aura components, right? You invested over the last years a lot of time and money and testing, blood and sweat, in crafting your own Aura applications, your components. And what's going to happen with with this investment, right? What's going to happen with this investment? And it won't go away, right? I mean, we as Salesforce also invested a lot of Aura, and we won't migrate that within the next 6 months or so. It's it's a long process, if it even, because when you look at how you want to adopt Lightning Web Components, you have to look into how and when does it make sense to adopt that. There are many good reasons why you just want to rewrite a lot of your applications, a lot of your components, but there are also at the same time a lot of reasons why you may just not want to touch existing components. So that's why it's really important to us to say, okay, we made it possible that Aura and Lightning Web Components can live happily on the same page, right? In fact, there are two options how a Lightning Web Component and an Aura component can live on a Flexi page or in general on an application. And you see that here on the screen. The first example is you have an Aura component and we have our contact list, that from the previous event example. And in this case, we do a few things, right? We embed a Lightning Web Component within an Aura component, which is a totally supported pattern, right? And we use also eventing mechanism from a child component, which is a Lightning Web Component, to an Aura component. So you can also communicate from your Lightning Web Component up to your Aura component. What I'm going to, and we are going to digest this example a bit more. In a similar way, we use Aura pubsub over here between an Aura component and Lightning Web Components on a sibling-based approach, right? So all options that I just showcased for eventing are applicable also for this interop layer world. And I think that's really important because you may want to start tomorrow or next week by building your first Lightning Web Components, and you have your existing applications and you want to integrate that somehow. Then you should know that you actually can do that without any issue, right? As you can see here, and this is something that we have to emphasize again, is that you can embed a Lightning Web Component within an Aura component. What you can't do is you can't embed an Aura component within a Lightning Web Component. That's just not possible based on the tech stack that is there, and it also wouldn't make much sense though. Now let's take a look at the Aura embedded LWC component over here. I'm going to close all those. I don't want to save them. And Aura embedded LWC. So this is now our Aura component that includes our Lightning Web Component. And when you look at the markup over here, it's totally transparent for me as a developer if that is a Lightning Web Component or an Aura component, right? I just don't know that. I just don't see it, which is pretty cool, right? Because you can just assume, okay, this is a component that I can use within my Aura component, no matter which programming model it is following, right? No matter if it's an Aura or a Lightning Web Component. And it again has also an untagged on event handler, like on contact select, like you saw from the previous example, where we talked about events, right? So on contact select, and it will run in my controller in the Aura world, my handle contact select. Now, when I take a look at the contact list, let's just open this one, contact list. It's just a standard Lightning Web Component. So that's pretty easy. Sending an event is the same way as you would, as you saw it before, right? I'm just creating a new custom event. I'm giving it a name, contact select in my case, and here I have, a JSON back with some bigger or more richer details, contact ID where I'm passing up some value data. So when you have your Lightning Web Component, you may not know where it will get used later, right? Within a Lightning Web component or an Aura component. And it shouldn't matter, and it doesn't matter, because you can just craft your own Lightning Web component, and it can then be reused within Aura or Lightning Web components. What you should, or what we should actually take a look on, is this on-context select handler, because that's a bit different, right? So I have, if you remember, the custom event has a property which is called detail. So when I'm going to look here at my controller, you'll see that I have my handle context select here. I'm getting event get param, and then I'm addressing the contact ID. So let me actually put that side by side so that it's really more obvious to understand. I have within the JSON body with my Lightning Web component detail, then my JSON body with contact ID, and that has a value. But within my Aura controller, you see there is no detail. So based on the mechanism provided, you don't have to fetch first the get param on detail, right? So you don't have to run this and then to extract contact ID. No, you actually get with get param access to the detailed property within the custom event, which really simplifies that. And from there on, it's standard behavior, event get param. You should know that to some extent from the Aura component world, and can just use it over there, right? But this is like a real powerful example how you can use the interoperability between Aura components and Lightning Web components. Okay, so let's talk a bit about, see we have some more time. Let's talk about one of my most favorite topics, and that is debugging. Because when we build applications as developers, we try to be perfect, right? But let's face it, we're not always be perfect. And what's look great in code and on linting within our IDE may or may not work at some point at runtime when the browser is actually running something and is trying to execute something, and we have to inspect that. Now let's take a simple example. I have my chart bar over here, right? I have my chart bar over here. Or let's say, yeah, this one. Now, how can we debug that? When we go to inspect, you can first look in the markup, right? Because of web components in general and of the specifications that are used with web components, you can see your Lightning Web components within the DOM tree. So I'm going to search here for chart bar, and there it is, right? You see that I have this custom tag, which is part of the custom element that is part of the different specifications that make out web components in general. You can now see where your own components are. And the fun thing is, as every base Lightning component is also a Lightning Web component, you can also inspect them over here, right? So just on a side note, if you ever look for this, open small if Lightning dash, I'm just seeing on a standard page 272 web components just running on this page, right? Which is, I think, pretty cool because all the base Lightning components and other components use the technology that we're providing with you for developing on the platform. Now, this is part one. You can just find your own component much better, like see chart bar. Oh, there it is. Whatever is CSS is not working. Whatever you want to inspect. Now, at some point, you may want to look into the JavaScript for that. So I'm going here into my sources tab, Lightning, and I am here on my standard page. Now, you may remember, if you ever looked into this from Aura components, there's this Aura folder, right? And this was based on the different Aura components that we looked at before. Now, new is, for Lightning Web Components, this modules folder. And this modules folder holds all the JavaScript for all Lightning Web Components. So let's example all those that get loaded. Let's take the API property. And on the first time you're going to open this, it will look pretty much like this, right? And you think, oh my gosh, how can I really debug this? All the different characters and all one line, and is it really easy? So one tip is, you can pretty print that. It's number one, right? And after you pretty print it, you will get a much better view. And at some point, you also see access to the different parts of your application, right? And when I'm going to move this a bit, let me actually open the API percentage over here. It is actually going to look much more than the code that you have in your IDE, so that you then can also start to debug that, right? So let's open the API property JS file. There you go. And I see here that I have my handle percentage change function, and it's just changing, event target value for this percentage, right? It looks a bit different because I have an A in here, and we'll come to that in a bit. But what I can do now is I can actually set a breakpoint in here, right? I can set a breakpoint in code that looks much like the code that I have in my IDE. And once I'm going to, change it over here, it will jump into my breakpoint. So let's take a look at this, how it looks in a bit more. So there we go, smaller font. Now, I can actually inspect the values, right? And work with all the values that I have in here. And I think this is pretty powerful because I have now access to all the things that a standard web developer also uses for debugging their applications. So if I go to my chopper component, I'm going to pretty print that too. This is the one that draws the data, right? So I'm going to execute that once more. I'm going to change the value in here. Yes, I don't need this one again. And now my custom getter gets called, right? And I have access to my percentage. I can actually access all those values. I can even use the standard console and just access this percentage, right? And can, mutate data, work with that, set my own functions, whatever kind of debugging capability you would use. And all of this without having any special Chrome extension installed, right? This is just out of the box debugging capability, which is super powerful. You get some more power when you actually use debug mode. So I'm going to enable that. Now for a second, there we go. I'm going to enable these, there we go. Please only do that if necessary in production, right? We all know these things. I'm going to refresh once more. There we go. So you can see we get we get a lot more traffic now in the console, which is fine. We're not really focusing on that right now. But if I'm going to inspect my modules over here, and let's take Apex wire to function. I think that's a good example because they're automatically pre-printed, which is pretty cool, and they give you even better access to the JavaScript that you see in the Lightning Web Component, right? All the things get not minified. When I run my wired contacts over here, so wire method to function, I'm going to refresh this page. I can actually, directly drill into the data, right? That is provided. I can inspect what's coming back here from my Apex call. And that I think that's pretty powerful for standard debugging capabilities compared to what you usually have or what you currently have with our components when you don't use the Lightning Inspector Chrome extension for that. Shameless plug, if you want to learn more about that, we have on developer.salesforce.com/blogs a new blog published I think 4 weeks ago, where all the different steps that you have to obey and that you can do, have for JavaScript, all the examples, custom formatting, and a few other things directly described so that you can apply that to your workflow when building Lightning Web Components. Okay, let me focus on one more thing, and I think that's brand new and also super exciting. I didn't tell Amit about that, but that's fine. So one thing that was in the past not as simple as it could be or should be was how to actually test your components in general. And as Lightning Web Components are built upon standards like custom elements, HTML templates, and this is no technology that we just invented for our own, but really applied based on web standards. I really have to iterate that. We also can provide our developers the opportunity to leverage standard tools when it comes to all the different things that you can do with your web components. And one of that includes unit testing. Now, some people may say, "Oh my gosh, I don't like testing." And as developers, we don't like two things: that's writing documentation, and that's testing our applications. But those are equally important. Now, with Lightning Web Components, we as Salesforce provide you a new tool which is called LWC Jest. It is an extension to the famous Jest testing library. For those of you who don't know Jest yet or haven't heard about that, Jest is a testing library that Facebook created for basically testing React applications. And over the last couple of years, Jest really evolved to, I would say, nearly the most popular testing framework when you follow different stats that you can see in different surveys. It become really popular. Now, as said, with LWC Jest, we as Salesforce also provide the capability that you can test the Lightning Web Components. And I want to give you a real brief example on how that would actually look like. For those of you who may wonder, will we introduce minimum code coverage like the Apex? And no, there's currently, as far as I know, no plan that you have any code coverage on that. Personally, I highly recommend to write unit tests because just based on general industry experience, it is that around 70% of all tests, of all errors are found either by developers when they walk through their code and test their things on their own, but also by unit tests. So as farther down you go on the development pipeline, like in higher environments and so forth, as more expensive an error gets. So it's really one of the main reasons why it's really encouraged that you build in unit tests for a good practice. Now let me open my hello. Okay, let me quickly go back to my recipes application. And I want to open for that hello HTML. This is the most basic Lightning Web Component that we have in our recipes application. You can see we have a standard Lightning cut in here, a div, and this div has greeting. Now, when I look at the greeting, when you look at the greeting, then we have a JavaScript file that, hang on. That happens with kids on Saturday afternoons, sorry. In the JavaScript file, we have a standard private property, which is called greeting world. Now, when I look at a unit test for that, the question is what needs to be actually tested? And you want to test in your unit tests that this div actually contains the value of greeting. Now let's open the test for that. And you will find any unit tests, closing this, you will have to populate every unit test as a subfolder of your Lightning Web component. It's __ tests $_. This is the convention, and the file name that we really encourage you to have is give it the first name portion as your Lightning Web component has, like in our case, hello. And in the ending always must be .test.js. Now, when I click on this, you will see a few things. First of all, it starts with create element from LWC. Now, some people will say, oh my gosh, I can automatically create elements from LWC, like dynamic component creation. And no, you can't. This is an API that we only expose in test-only cases, right? So you import create element from LWC so that the testing engine can actually create this element. The second step is you import the Lightning Web component that you want to put under test. And this also means you only want to test this component, right? Don't test 5 components in one test. No, you will only want to test the functionality of your own Lightning Web component. So this is the hello Lightning Web component. So we're importing it from C/hello. Now, and you will find a lot of, a bunch of documentation on the web for that, because just standard has the way of test suites and tests. And a test suite is to start with describe and an individual test with it. Now, the important part is first you should write down and note how your test should work. And you should read it out, because it means see hello, displays a greeting, right? So it should be really descriptive on what it means. If I would open a more complex test, let's go on Apex imperative test. Don't get overwhelmed, it's a lot in here, but it's like see Apex imperative method renders 2 context return from imperative Apex call, or see Apex imperative method renders the error panel when the Apex method returns an error, right? So describe and it, those blocks should be really used to describe your test to make it easier for you to focus on what should get tested, but also for everyone else to actually understand what this test should do. Now, we're not focusing on this after each, but here's the very simple notion of how a UI test or how a test with Jest would actually work. First of all, you create an element. So you create your web component. You specify the name of the web component. And then it gets appended to the document's body. So this actually then initializes the Lightning Web component, and it also renders it. So the connected callback and the rendered callback lifecycle methods on the Lightning Web component are called. And then you have basically a backend version of your Lightning Web component where you can interact with. Now, when we look back on the actual HTML file, we have that this div should contain hello world. Now, for this, we are saying const div, we say element, give us access to the shadow root, and we're running a standard query selector, right? Div. Now, once we got that text content value or the value of that div, you would have to run a verification, an assert, and that's expect the text content property of the div to be hello world, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and just one of many examples on how you could test Lightning Web components. One of the big benefits on actually having this standard test framework just available is also, I'm going just to run this, Oh, that's great. There you go. One of the big benefits is you can run tests locally, right? So I just tested my Hello Test Lightning Web Component test with Jest locally on my machine, which is pretty cool because then I can run my tests not only as developer during my lifecycle, but also during my continuous integration and continuous deployment process. You will find in our LWC recipes sample application at around, I think, 130 different tests now across mostly all recipes, right? So we went through the exercise that like, okay, we have a recipe for Apex imperative method. So let's provide tests that showcase how to test this specific piece of functionality. You have a recipe that talks about child to parent, and where we have all the component interaction and event interaction. So let's showcase with tests how you all as developers can actually run those tests, right? When it comes to how to best use eventing mechanisms. Okay, so I'm getting a question: is test coverage a must for prod migration similar to Apex? And I mentioned before, no, it is not. Right? I really highly encourage that you should do that. And Jest has some. I'm just going to do this. Jest code coverage. There are a bunch of options in the standard Jest framework, right? For collect coverage or in general coverage, directory thresholds. These are really important parts where you can say, okay, you really need this part of your coverage. You want this maybe for a specific project. You want this in general. You want to not allow the merge of a pull request into a specific branch if the percentage of functions tested is below 60%. You can define that. There's currently no requirement currently given, but again, I think it's a best practice to have that actually in there. We will provide on. Okay, I see another question. For Jest framework, do we need to install managed package? No, you don't. We actually have some awesome documentation available, but you can also get the documentation here on GitHub. github.com/salesforce/LWC Jest. This is where the whole testing tool, LWC Jest, is hosted. Just give some great instructions how to actually set up things. The sample apps, like the recipes application, also contains a full configuration for Jest. And we will publish next week on Tuesday also a blog post on developer.salesforce.com where I will go through all different best practices that got applied while we added all the Jest tests to the LWC recipes sample application. And having said that, I think we reached the end. Amit, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you, Ren. This session is really helpful. And guys, if you have any question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question directly.
Hi, Ren. This is Madhur.
Hi.
Yeah, I have one question. Like we have pubsub library, like specifically for Lightning Web Component. So do we have any documentation if we want to customize a little bit for the reference point? Like does Salesforce provide any documentation for this?
No, so pubsub is just it's a utility library that we provided by our own, just because there's currently this feature gap where we don't have a platform provided mechanism to give you the capability like application events, right? There's a new service planned, and I saw that recently, Lightning Eventing Service, I think it's a planned name, where you can do this kind of cross communication. But for now, we provide this pubsub library. If you want to change that, fine, right? You can just use that. I mean, it's just available as shown here as as a web component. So you can just modify the source as you need, right? And as you want. I would like to give it another name so that it's people don't get confused, but you can change it as you want or need. Right, this is just the best practice within the library that we applied with our engineers when we talked through on how can we actually provide the best mechanism to provide you this kind of functionality.
Okay, and I have one more question. So we have now ES6 JavaScript, and so it supports all those functions in the Salesforce LWC, or some few specific like which they have mentioned in their documents.
Yeah, so it's even better. It's even better because we don't only support ES6, we also go up to ES9, up to ECMAScript 2018. So that's a question that we a lot get. So looking back, when you look at our components, we gave you one thing, ES5, right? So standard JavaScript, and you couldn't leverage all the real cool things that you can do with JavaScript. Now, what we decided to do is, and let me quickly bring up a browser for that, is because developer experience is important, right? It's really important. We added support for, and you can find this in documentation, for up to ES9 in there. And what's happening is on the other side is like you will say, okay, but not everything is supported in IE 11, right? So what the Lightning Web Component framework is providing you, the engine is providing you, is you can use within the JavaScript files of your Lightning Web Component all the modern capabilities of JavaScript, and you don't have to know and to take care of what browser it will run in, because at the end we are going to transpile and we're going to polyfill based on the browser where it's running into. So you can really leverage the latest and greatest. But if you have a customer that's running, or your own organization is running things in IE 11, that shouldn't be a problem for you, because we are taking care of that for you with the engine.
Okay, thanks, Ren.
So any other question from a Okay, then I'm not able to find any other question on the chat window. It's look like we are still good. And thank you, Rennie, for this great session, and thank you everyone for joining this session. And after a couple of hours, I will post this video on our YouTube channel. So if you want to practice again, you can follow the stuff from here. Thank you everyone for the joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amit.